Every woodworking project is a learning experience, and my latest one is no different. It took me months to prepare for and months to complete, and that's exactly what we're going to take a look at in today's compilation video. Workbenches are a staple in any shop, and I've built a lot of them over the years. But I've never put in as much time and effort into a workbench as I did with this latest project. In that project, I tested out a bunch of different ways of building things, and I tried a lot of new techniques. And I think the results speak for themselves. I couldn't be more pleased with how this bench turned out. So come along with me as I build this amazing new bench from scratch from start to finish. Well, I've been procrastinating for way too long now. I've been putting off building some storage cabinets in my shop for months now. And today we're going to start the process of building these cabinets in this multi-part series. So let's not waste any time and start off with this build. So let me start off by saying I'm no cabinet builder, and I think that might be the appeal for this video, as we're going to walk through this build together and learn as we go. You see, I built a couple of benches early in my woodworking career, and this is one of them. A couple of things that I don't like about this bench is that it doesn't have any drawers or cabinets to put things away. All my tools get dusty as time goes on. Which probably means I don't need some of those tools, but let's face it, I'm not one to throw away tools. More importantly, however, I have no organization with that bench. Another bench that I made very early in my woodworking career is the one that sits right behind my table saw, and this has become a complete eyesore. It's got two flat surfaces, and all those surfaces do is to collect more tools. And it's right where this bench sits that we're going to build these new cabinets. So let's take a look at the design I've created so that we can get started. So here's a basic look at the cabinet design. Each one of these cabinets will be 2 feet wide, making the entire span 12 feet. And today we're going to be focusing on making the carcasses for these cabinets, and I'm going to try it in 4 different ways to see which way I enjoy doing most. Now if we go back to the drawing, you'll notice that there's 6 cabinets, 2 that are labeled B and 4 that are labeled A. The A cabinets are made in the exact same fashion, and the B cabinets are also made in the same fashion. The B cabinets will only have stretchers on top of them, as we'll add a solid surface on the top of those 2 cabinets in the end. The A cabinets will all have solid surface tops. And as of right now, I'm not quite sure what I'll put above the desk area, but I could foresee myself putting some more cabinets, some shelves, or even some French cleats. Now to build these carcasses, I know that I need exactly 4 sheets of 3/4 inch birch plywood as well as 1 sheet of 1/4 inch birch plywood. And that's because I tried out the app that I've been hearing about, the Cut List Optimizer. Let's take a look at the results it gave me. And this app really couldn't be easier to use. You simply add all the dimensions of the pieces you need for your project, and then it places them on a sheet of plywood for you so that you know your exact cuts. Once all the sheets of plywood are laid out, you can export the report to give you a cut list for all of your plywood. So with that cut list in hand, I made a trip outside of the shop to break down the plywood. And whenever I break down plywood, I always like to make my lengthwise cut first before I do any of my cross cuts. And with my first sheet of plywood ripped lengthwise, I can then break down my other 3 sheets. And here's 1, 2, and 3. And with my 4 sheets of plywood ripped down to more manageable pieces, I can then take them into the shop to clean up the factory edge, which for the wider pieces is exactly at 23.5 inches. So I'm not taking off a whole lot here, and I've got 4 of these boards to clean up. Next, I can adjust my fence to the thinner dimension, which is at 22.5 inches. And for this dimension, I only have to do this to 3 of the strips of plywood. Once I have all this plywood cut to width, I can now begin to do some cross-cutting. And for this, I'm actually going to dust off a tool that I don't use that often, and that's the Festool MFT. And I'm using the MFT because these strips are just a little bit wider than my miter saw can handle. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll set my fence to 31 inches exactly, which is the length that a lot of these strips need to be cut to. Now even though I've cleaned up the factory edges on the side, the ends are not clean, so I'll need to square those up. Once I have one end clean, I can flip the stop block down and cut it down to size at 31 inches. Now these long strips were a little bit difficult to manhandle on the MFT, but I was able to get it done. One thing that really helped was to put an MFT clamp on the edge of the board and put support underneath the edge that was hanging off. And each one of these plywood strips gave me 3 pieces, so once the first cut was done, the other 2 were much easier. Then it was just a matter of rinse and repeat until all the strips were cut. Now, as I said earlier, the Festool MFT is not something that I use on a daily basis, but it really is a lifesaver when you need to make cross cuts on larger pieces of wood. Now, one thing that's very important about the Festool MFT is it needs to be calibrated every time you use it. It's really important that that back fence and the track are completely perpendicular, so I always spend a lot of time to make sure that they're perfectly square. But once it's calibrated, you can blaze through cuts very quickly. So now that we've cut all the sides for these cabinets down to size, I now want to focus on the bottoms of the cabinets and some of the tops. So this is where we're going to cross cut our third sheet of plywood that we cut a little bit thinner at 22.5 inches. And you can see from our cut list that the dimensions of these pieces are 22.5 by 23.5 inches. Since we know the cutoffs of the pieces we just cut are exactly 23.5 inches long, we can use this to set the fence of the MFT. So what I'll do is I'll take one of the cutoffs and I'll make sure the edge of it is completely flush with our track. Once we've done that, I can adjust the fence on the MFT on the opposite side of the cutoff. And this should give us our perfect 22.5 by 23.5 pieces for the bottoms and the top. So in the same fashion, I quickly cross-cut our last 2 strips that were 22.5 inches down to size. Now that we have all the sides as well as the tops and bottoms for some of these cabinets cut out, we need to cut out the stretchers. And these are just 3-inch strips, so we'll do that over at the table saw. Now I kind of went back and forth with this, but since I had a large crosscut sled, I was able to use the crosscut sled to cut these strips down to 3 inches. We've got one more task to do, and that's to put in the slot for the back panel, which is made out of 1/4-inch plywood. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I'm just taking a piece of the scrap 3/4-inch plywood and adjusting my table saw height so that it goes about halfway through that plywood. And since I want this 1/4-inch plywood to sit in front of the 3/4-inch stretchers, I'll take that same piece of 3/4-inch plywood and place it in between the blade and the fence and lock the fence down. And with all those adjustments made, I can make my first pass on the plywood. And I'll have to make this groove on all the side panels, and there's a lot of side panels here, so I'll go through all the panels and make that groove. Now, one thing that I did before making all these cuts is I labeled the front and the back of each one of the panels. That way I could be ensured that I'm making the cut on the right side of the panel. With the first pass made on all the panels, it's now time to make the second pass. And to do this, I'm simply tapping my fence over just a tad to increase the width of that groove. Then I can take a piece of scrap 1/4-inch plywood and make sure that it fits that groove perfectly. Once I was happy with the results, I could then increase the width of that groove on all the other panels. And while I was making my second pass, I was paying a lot of attention to where my first cut was. This is a great place to make a mistake if you're not paying attention. After all those grooves are cut, I thought this would be a great opportunity to put some shelf pinholes in all the cabinets that won't be receiving drawers. And once again, I'm really pleased with this going make jig. This makes this whole process quick and easy. Now we have most of the pieces cut out for the entire cabinet carcasses, except for the very back, and we'll do that at the very end. Now, right about now, you're probably asking about the toe kick, and that's something we'll address at the end of the video. Now, as I was cutting all these pieces out, I had a couple of thoughts that made me want to change the design of this project, and we're going to pivot a bit. And this change is only going to affect 2 cabinets. I want to move the top cabinets to the very side, giving me just a little bit more counter space. Now, the nice thing about this is it actually uses less material, as it's going to give us a longer surface all along the top. Which basically means instead of having to cover the entire tops of those 2 cabinets with plywood, now all we have to do is add stretchers. So let's get into building these cabinets. Now, as I said in the very beginning of the video, I want to try putting these cabinets together in a couple different ways, actually 4 ways. And this will just be a personal test for me, since I'm kind of a newbie at this, to see which way I think works best for me when putting together cabinets. So I'll assemble 4 cabinets in 4 different ways, and then I'll assemble the last 2 using the preferred method. So what are the 4 ways we're going to do this? Well, we're going to use glue and brad nails, we're going to use glue and screws, we're going to use glue and pocket holes, and finally we're going to use glue and dominoes. So let's start off with what I assume will be the easiest of the bunch, but probably the least sturdy until the glue dries, the glue and brad nails. So this is about as simple as it gets. The first thing that I'll do is I'll add glue to all the seams and then place the 2 seams together. Then I can add a couple of these corner clamps to keep them in place while I drive in some brad nails. Once the first side panel was attached, I also added some F-style clamps to make sure that all the seams were coming together nicely. Once both side panels were attached, I could then add the stretchers using a little bit of glue and some quick clamps to hold them into place. Then I could nail them all together and secure this thing up. Once all the stretchers were in place, I then slid in the back 1/4-inch panel without any wood glue. Once that back panel was in position, I locked it into place with a couple of brad nails. Well, that's going to make our assembly of our first cabinet with brad nails and glue complete. So what are my overall impressions? Well, it went together very quickly, which is nice, and it's actually a little bit more sturdy than what I was expecting. However, you will notice I still have some clamps on this. And that's because the joints, although square, are really hard to get tight. Therefore, you have to add a few clamps to get that glue squeeze out. And it's really that glue that's going to hold this cabinet together. So let's try out our second option, which is wood screws and glue. Now this is a great option for shop furniture. It's quick and easy and very secure. Simply add the wood glue, pre-drill and countersink some holes, and then drive in some screws. And for these cabinets, I'm just going to use some ordinary 1¼ wood screws. Now one of the only downfalls of using this method is you're going to have exposed screws on any exterior surface where you drive in those screws. But for shop furniture, I really don't see a problem with this. That being said, however, I am trying to migrate away from having shop furniture that just looks like it was pieced together with glue and screws. And because of this, I'm probably going to only use these cabinets for interior cabinets where all those screws will be hidden. But this is an extremely easy method and doesn't really even require any clamps. After everything is glued and screwed together, we can add the back panel and tack it into place. Well, that's going to wrap up our second cabinet made entirely from wood glue and screws. My overall impression is this thing is very sturdy. And it took about the same amount of time to build as our other cabinet that we built with the brad nails and glue. The only issue with this cabinet is, however, is you see those exposed screws. But let's check out our next cabinet, which we're going to put together with pocket hole screws and glue. So this method takes a little bit more work up front, as you're going to have to add pocket holes to all of your joints. And there's a lot of pocket holes when building a cabinet. I'll first start off with all the stretchers. After all those stretchers are done, I can then add pocket holes to the bottom of the cabinet on both sides. And once again, I'm using the Going Make pocket hole jig, which in this case seems to do a really good job and is very comparable to the Craig jig. Once all those pocket holes are done, we can then begin to add wood glue and pocket hole screws. And for 3/4-inch plywood, it's recommended to use 1¼ coarse threaded pocket hole screws. Now the nice thing about pocket hole screws is once again you don't need a whole lot of clamps. Typically, I just use a pocket hole clamp to get things started, and then once a screw's driven in, everything is held together nicely. Now I'm not sure wood glue is entirely necessary when using pocket hole screws for shop furniture. However, I'm not quite sure what I'll be putting in these cabinets, so I want this thing to be built like a brick shitter. So better to put in a strong foundation now and not have any regrets later. After everything's screwed together nice and tight, I can slide in that back panel and tack it into place. Well, that's going to make our third cabinet put together with pocket hole screws and wood glue. This was a little bit more time consuming to make, but it came together very nicely. Now I already noticed I made one mistake on the very top here, as the pocket hole screws should have been on the top versus the bottom of this cabinet. However, I don't think they'll get seen that often and it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And this is my favorite assembly so far. It's very sturdy and it doesn't have those exposed screws like the last cabinet that we just built. But we have one more cabinet to build, and for this I'm going to break out my rarely used and very expensive domino joiner. And right off the bat, I'm already recognizing a real issue here, as the setup for laying out these dominoes is going to be a pain in the butt. So one of the first things that I did is I tried to figure out where my layout line should be using these squares. And I realized this is going to be a real pain in the butt to mark out those lines for the dominoes. And that's when I remembered that domino joiners have these spring-loaded tabs. This allows you to place your wood right up against that tab so that your dominoes can be perfectly aligned. So using those tabs, I began to bore out my mortises for those panels. And right off the bat, I made a huge error. And this was all my fault. Since I don't use the domino joiner that often, I tend to have to relearn how to use the tool. I actually had the wrong size bit in place, so I had to relearn how to switch out that bit. But once I had the correct bit in and the depth set appropriately, I was able to quickly bore out those mortises. With the mortises in place, I could then add some dominoes and some wood glue and put this thing together. Now, even though everything fit together nicely, it wasn't exactly easy to get this thing to come together. I still had to use clamps to get that glue squeeze out and get the panels to seat together nicely. Once I had the panels in place, it was time to add the mortises for the stretchers. And this became quite the challenge. I had to use the loose setting on the domino joiner along with the tight setting to get these stretchers to fit perfectly. And going back and forth, adding glue, adding clamps, and getting everything to fit together perfectly was kind of a pain in the butt. This took way longer than any other assembly, and caused a lot more frustration. Not to mention, I still had to use clamps on this assembly until that glue set, making this by far the most time-consuming build out of the 4. Well, that's going to make our 4th cabinet assembled with dominoes and glue, and I've got nothing to say but that sucked. Now, it's probably due to my inexperience of doing the setup for cabinets with the domino joiner, but this cabinet took me twice as long as any other cabinet. Now, the cabinet does feel very secure and it's got no visible joinery, which is a nice bonus. But for me, the setup time using the domino joiner is just not worth it. So which assembly method did I like the most? Well, if I had to pick one way to assemble a cabinet, I'd have to say the glues and screws. The problem is I just don't like seeing those screws on the outside of the cabinet. And because of this, I'm going to have to go with the old favorite of using pocket hole screws and glue. So I'm going to assemble the last 2 cabinets using pocket hole joinery, and then we can work on the toe kicks and wrap up this video. And I won't bore you by going through this whole process again, but this went much smoother. It's quick, it's easy, and it doesn't require a whole lot of clamps to hold it into place until that glue sets. And even though it does require a little bit more work on the front end, once those screws are in place, this thing is ready to go. So I finally got all 6 cabinets built, and I'll have to say I'll stick with my decision on going with pocket holes for the last 2 cabinets. So now it's time to tackle the toe kicks, and this is a method that I've never tried before, so we're going to go through this process together. And this entire toe kick is going to be made out of good old-fashioned 2x4s. So the first measurement that I need is the length of 3 of the cabinets together, and that comes in at right about 72 inches. The next measurement that I need is the depth of the cabinets, and as to be expected, it's right at 23.5. So I'm first going to mark out 2 of the 2x4s to about 66 inches. This will give me about a 3-inch overhang on either side of the cabinets. So I'll cut the 2 2x4s together so that they're the exact same length. Next, I'll set my stop block at 17.5 for the stretchers of the toe kick. This will give me a 3-inch overhang for the toe kick, and it accounts for the thickness of those 2x4s. Once I've cut all these stretchers down to size, I can begin assembly. And for this, I'm simply using 3-inch wood screws to connect everything together. And here I'll add 2 screws on either side of the stretchers. I'm going to have 2 on each end and 3 in the middle. So here's the idea of how I understand this toe kick to work. The first thing that you want to do is to take a level and make sure that your toe kick is completely level in every direction. And I got really lucky on this, as I'm completely level both horizontally and vertically. But if I wasn't level, this is where I would add the shims. And because I'm so lucky, I can begin to add 3 cabinets to each toe kick. Once they were in place, I could give them a little bit of a toe test and everything looked good. And once I have one set of cabinets leveled out and on top of those toe kicks, it's important to do the same thing with the other cabinets. And it's also important to make sure that the cabinets are level to each other, as we're going to be placing a solid surface that runs the span of this entire cabinet length. So who knew an MFT can double as a light bulb changer? Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. Today we're going to continue on with my cabinet build. So let's not waste any time and get into this video. So if you haven't seen the first video, I'll leave a link to this video right here in the description below. This is where I built 4 different cabinets 4 different ways. In that video, I built cabinets using brad nails and glue, screws and glue, pocket holes and glue, and dominoes and glue. And there was one clear-cut winner. And you guessed it, it was the good old-fashioned pocket hole joinery method that I thought was the best way to make cabinets. And that's because not only is it easy, but it's much more time efficient. But that wasn't the only thing that we covered in that video. We also went over how to build a simple toe kick for these cabinets. Let's remove one of these cabinets and take a look. Underneath these cabinets, it's a simple 2x4 construction to raise these cabinets off the floor. And this allows us to create a cabinet carcass that's much more easy to construct. Let's take a look. As you can see, these cabinets are just plain boxes with no cutout toe kick on the very bottom. And after creating my cabinets this way, I don't think I'll ever go back to cutting out the toe kick in the cabinet itself, as this is just a much easier process and it goes by a lot quicker. So what are we doing today? Well, we're actually going to be doing 5 things. The first thing I want to do is to attach those cabinets to the wall. After that, we're going to add a countertop on the very top of those cabinets. Once we're done with that, we're going to make a face frame and attach that face frame. And then finally, we're going to wrap that toe kick with some plywood. So let's get started and continue on with this cabinet building process. So the first thing that I need to address is the trim that's on the bottom of this wall where the cabinets will be installed. I need to remove some of this trim, but before we do that, I need to make sure everything's level. Once I've confirmed that it's level, I also want to make sure that those cabinets are perfectly centered on that toe kick. So I'll take a measurement on both sides just to confirm that we have 3 inches all the way around. I also want to make sure that these cabinets are cinched together since they're not attached yet, so I'll take some clamps just to make sure everything is nice and tight. Once I've done all that, I'm simply going to take a pencil and trace out the outline of the cabinets on that back trim. And I'll do this process on both sides. Once all those markings have been made, I can then take off all the clamps and remove the cabinets as well as the toe kick. Once everything's been removed, you can see the scribe lines I made for the profile of the cabinets. These scribe lines essentially show the outline of the toe kick on either side of the cabinet. Now that those scribe lines have been drawn, I can now unbox my latest toy. And I'll have to say I'm pretty pleased with this little multi-tool. I looked at a couple of other brands, but since I'm already in the Ryobi battery infrastructure, the others were just too cost prohibitive. And I really like the quick release, which allows you to easily switch out blades on the fly. With the tool juiced up, it was ready to start making some cuts. Now I don't have a whole lot of experience with multi-tools other than the fact that I used one when I installed my children's flooring. But one thing that I did learn when using this tool is it's good to get it started before you bring the tool to the cut. And I unfortunately learned this the hard way. If you take your tool and place it right on the line that you want to cut and then start your tool, there's a good chance that that tool is going to move on you. Once I had those profiles on both sides cut out, I could then take the tool and run it along the top of that trim. After that, I could take my mini crowbar and a hammer and pull that trim off. Once that trim was removed, I could then place my toe kick and the cabinets on top just to see how well everything fit. And I'll have to say I was quite pleased with the results on either side. But there's no time for celebrating as we have 2 of these to install. And the second one went a little smoother as I was refamiliarized with that multi-tool. I simply traced my scribe lines and then cut through the caulking that was on the top of that trim. Once that trim was freed up, I could do a little demo and break it away from the wall. And thankfully, the second set of cabinets fit just as well as the first set. Not too shabby. With all these cabinets now in place, I now want to attach each one of the 3 cabinets together. Then we can mount it to the wall. So for this process, I'm going to use 1¼ cabinet screws. But before I attach them, I want to make sure that these cabinets are cinched up nice and tight, so I'll just add a few clamps. With everything pulled together, I can then sink a couple of screws into each cabinet. With the first set of cabinets attached, I can then move on to the second set. And I'll just repeat the process of cinching them all together with clamps. And the nice thing about using clamps before you screw them together is you can get the cabinets completely flush with no seam in between the 2 cabinets. And with everything tight and flush, I can then drive in a couple of screws. And I'm not sure whether or not this is the correct way to do it, but I only drove in screws into the center cabinet, driving screws from the center cabinet into both sides. With those cabinets now attached to each other, I'm now going to attach them to the wall. Now in my case, I've got 3/4 inch ply on my wall, but if you don't have 3/4 inch ply, you may want to make sure that you look for the studs. Now although it wasn't imperative for me since I have the 3/4 inch plywood, I did break out my stud finder just to get an idea of where those studs lie. And with a general idea of where those studs were, it was now time to grab some screws. And for this I used 1 3/4 screws. Now if you remember from my previous video where we constructed these cabinets, you'll know that there's a nailer strip on the top and the bottom of each cabinet. And although we can't see these strips since we have the 1/4 inch plywood on the back of the cabinets, we want to make sure we're driving in our screws into those nailer strips. And for each one of the cabinets, I drove in 3 screws into the top nailer and 2 screws into the bottom one. Once those 5 screws were in each cabinet, it really tightened everything up. Not only did it pull those cabinets in tight up against that wall, but it also pinned down the toe kick. And it's for this reason that I'm not actually attaching those toe kicks to the cabinets. I've seen a few people saying that you don't actually need to attach these toe kicks, so I thought what better opportunity to test this theory than to do it on some shop cabinets. With all these cabinets now attached to each other and attached to the wall, these things are rock solid. In fact, they're much more secure than I ever expected, but we need to put some countertops on these. Let me show you what I got for the countertops. Now you may remember from a few months ago, I built this drill press cabinet, and I made this out of butcher block, and I really like the way it looks. Not to mention these butcher blocks are made of solid birch, which means they're virtually indestructible. And I didn't get anything fancy here. I got the same butcher block that you get at Home Depot. I got 2 6-foot pieces and I got 1 4-foot piece. And my intentions here are to take the 2 6-foot pieces and place them right on top of these cabinets. And then I'll take the smaller chunk and make a small desk right in between the 2 cabinets that sits a little bit lower. So let's first start off by getting these 2 larger pieces mounted on top of those cabinets. Now originally I was going to make these countertops out of hardwood, but I did a little bit of math, and at today's hardwood prices and the time it would have taken me to build these countertops, it's actually a little bit cheaper to purchase these butcher blocks. Once I got everything unwrapped, I took the butcher block over to my cabinets. And once I put this countertop onto the cabinet, it became very evident that there was a good side and a bad side, so I made sure that the good side was facing up. Once I had that butcher block in place, I could then center it all the way around using a double square. Now to attach this top, we're simply going to screw through the 2 stretchers that are on top of each cabinet. And just to make sure that these screws don't interfere with future drawers, we're going to pre-drill and countersink. And this is probably just a little bit of overkill, but I'm adding 6 screws to each cabinet top. And to make driving in these screws just a little bit easier, I added a bit extender to my impact driver just to make sure that everything cleared. You'll also notice for the pre-drill and countersink, I'm using an Amana countersink bit. Having a countersink bit like this is a real time saver versus having to drill a hole and then grabbing a countersink bit and countersinking that hole. Once that countertop was attached, this thing felt rock solid. And with the first countertop done, it was time to move on to the second. And you'll notice as I place my double square on either side, we have about 1 1/4 overhang. And once that countertop was aligned, I then just ran down the line doing my pre-drill and countersink and then driving in the screws. And once those screws were in, the second countertop was just as solid as the first. So now that we have the 2 6-foot countertops installed, I now want to work on the desk portion, which will go right here. And in order to do this, I need to cut down this 4-foot piece of butcher block down to size. And I want a really tight fit here, so I made a story stick that just barely fits inside this gap. But I also need to think about support for this butcher block. Since there's no frame underneath this butcher block, we need to make a couple of cleats. And I'm going to make those cleats with this scrap piece of walnut, and I want that butcher block to sit 30 inches above the ground. And that's because a normal desktop is anywhere from 28 to 30 inches tall, and since I'm a little bit taller, I'm going to go with 30 inches. So you might be asking, how much did I spend on this butcher block? And for the 3 pieces, I spent just a little over $300. And this butcher block is by no means perfect. It's the cheapest I could find. But each piece did have a better side, so I just made sure that that side was up. So now knowing which side was which, I just need to cut it to size. So I'll use my story stick to set the fence on my table saw. With that story stick in between the blade and the fence, I can push the fence over and tighten it down. And this butcher block is 1.5 inches thick, so I just took this cut very slowly. With the block cut to size, I can now work on some cleats which will hold this top up. And for this, I'm just going to use a scrap piece of 5/4 walnut. And since our cabinets are about 2 feet deep, I want to cut this walnut a little shorter, right at 20 inches. So I'll set my stop block, clean up one edge, and cut it to size. And since this butcher block isn't exactly light, I want these cleats to have a little bit of thickness to them. So I'm going to set my fence to 1 3/4 inches and rip my 2 cleats. With both cleats cut, I want to take one of those cleats and place it right on top of my butcher block. Then I want to take the measurement of the cleat on top of that butcher block, and it comes in at 3 1/4 inches. So I'll subtract that 3 1/4 from 30 inches, and this will give me where the bottom of the cleat should rest, which is 26 3/4, so I'll mark this on the side of my cabinet. Then I can take a T-square and strike a line where that marking is. This is going to give me a reference line for where the bottom of the cleat should lie. To make things a little bit easier on installation, I'm going to add some double-sided tape to one side of the cleat. Then I can temporarily affix that cleat to the side of my cabinet, making sure that the bottom of the cleat is right where that line is. Once everything's lined up, I'll add a little bit of pressure to make that cleat stick. Then it's time to make the same marking on the other side at 26 3/4. Then once again, I'll take my T-square to carry that line across. And once again, with a little double-sided tape, we can attach that cleat to the other side. We'll just line up the bottom of our cleat with that line, add a little pressure, and we're good to go. With both cleats attached to each side of the cabinet, we'll pre-drill and countersink 3 holes into each cleat. And after that, we can secure them into place with 3 screws. With both cleats installed, we can slide that butcher block right into place. Now I don't want to have that butcher block just resting on those cleats, I also want to secure it. So I'll take my T-square and mark out the approximate location on the inside of those cabinets. Once those markings have been made, this gives me a general location for where I can pre-drill and countersink as well as drive in some screws. Well, that just about covers the installation of our countertops, and this thing is beginning to look pretty nice, but we need to do the face frame, so that's what we're going to do next. So I have a lot of 4/4 oak laying around the shop, and I think this is light enough to make a perfect face frame, but I need to get this wood milled up, so I'll first mark up one side of the wood. After that, through the jointer she goes until all those markings have disappeared. And once that side's cleaned up, I'll then work on the perpendicular edge. And you can probably tell this wood had a significant bow in it, so this took a while. In fact, it was so significant that I actually increased the depth of cut on my jointer. But once it was all said and done, I was able to get 2 clean sides on each one of these boards. After that, it was time to clean up the third side over at the planer. Now the standard thickness for a face frame is 3/4 of an inch, so I'm milling these up to exactly 3/4 of an inch. And this 3/4 of an inch is mainly due to the hinges that we'll be using for the doors on these cabinets. And to make sure we're right on target, it's the Dixie digital readout that comes to the rescue. With our exact measurement made at 3/4 of an inch, we can make our final passes. With 3 of the sides dimensioned on this wood, it's time to head over to the table saw. And for this face frame, I'm going to cut it to about 2 inches wide. This will ensure that it will cover up 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood that are nestled together with a little bit of overhang. And it's that little bit of overhang that will allow our European hinges to fit perfectly on that face frame. Once I have all my face frame stock milled up, it's now time to start thinking about cutting it to size. So I first want to take a measurement for the 2 stiles on either side. And these come in at about 31 1/8 inch. So I'll set my stop block to this measurement and slice up my first style. And before I cut up my other styles, I just want to test it out to make sure that I'm getting a good fit on those cabinets. And once I'm reassured, I can then cut up my other 3 exterior styles. With all 4 exterior styles cut out, it's now time to get the measurement for the rails. And it looks like it's coming in at about 71 7/8 inches. But since we're going to have styles on either side that are 2 inches wide, I need to subtract 4 inches, which gets me to 67 7/8. So I'll slice up my first rail to this measurement. With that rail made, I can then use referential measurements to cut the other 3 rails. Now each one of these face frames need 2 interior styles which need to be cut a little bit shorter than the exterior styles. 4 inches to be exact, as both rails are 2 inches wide, making a total of 4 inches. So with my stop block adjusted, I can then cut down my 4 interior styles. Now before I do any joinery with this face frame, I just want to line it up in front of that cabinet to make sure that it looks good and everything is aligning properly. And I'll have to say I'm pretty pleased with the results. Now I went back and forth on what type of joinery method to use here. I was going to use pocket hole screws, but since I have a domino joiner, I thought I'd break it out. And in my opinion, this is the perfect application for using a domino joiner. It doesn't do the best for building those cabinets, but when it comes to making joints for things like face frames, it's the perfect tool. Once I have all those alignment markings made, I can then begin to plunge out those mortises. And you'll notice while using this domino joiner, I have my face frame laid out on my assembly table. This serves a couple of purposes. It's very easy to get confused while using the domino joiner. By laying the face frame out like this, you can be assured that you're referencing the appropriate side of that face frame. Not only that, but by doing it slow and methodically, you can make sure that you're placing those mortises on the right side of the wood. And lastly, it allows me to really think about where I want to place those tight mortises and the loose mortises. And when I say the loose mortises, I typically only use the medium setting, as this gives me enough play so that I can adjust the joints. Once I have all those mortises cut out, I can then move on to the glue up process. And this was a little bit stressful, not necessarily for the glue up, but putting the clamps on. I really wanted to make sure that I got glue squeeze out on all those joints. But as you can tell, this is a pretty large face frame, and I don't have clamps that can reach the entire width of this frame. So once I got glue on all those dominoes and mortises, it was a race against time to get those clamps on. And I had to come up with a little bit of creative clamping. And I actually used 3 different types of clamps with this glue up. I used a bar clamp, quick clamps, as well as F-style clamps. And to reach the entire span of the face frame, you can see I'm using a combination of the bar clamp as well as a quick clamp. So while I let the glue from that face frame cure up, I want to tackle an issue that I left from my last video. Now you may remember that the toe kicks for these cabinets are just made out of 2x4s, and I've got some 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood that I want to wrap these 2x4s with. And I think I've got just enough left over from building the backs of these cabinets, so let's break this down and wrap that toe kick. So we'll first set the fence on our table saw to 3.5 inches. And that's because our toe kick is made out of 2x4s, and 2x4s are 3.5 inches wide. Once we have a few strips of this plywood cut out, we can then take it over to the toe kick. Once we slide a strip underneath that cabinet, I'll just take a pencil and mark off where I need to cut it down. And as to be expected, it slides right in and fits perfectly, and I'll just tack this in with a few brad nails. Now if this was a more high traffic area like a kitchen, I probably would have added some adhesive to this toe kick wrap. But since this is shop furniture, I don't think it's necessary in this application. And the brad nails should hold it in place just fine. And you will notice I'm placing that front wrap on the top of that side wrap just to cover up those plies from the front. Well, as you saw, that was super quick and easy, and I really think it makes a big difference in the overall appearance on the front of those cabinets. But what's going to make a bigger difference are these face frames, so let's get them out of clamps, sand them up, and get them on these cabinets. Surprisingly, my creative clamping worked, as all these joints came together nicely. Now, a lot of my focus on sanding was where the joints were, and this is because I wanted to get rid of all my domino layout lines as well as the glue squeeze out. But I also wanted to carry this sanding across the entire face frame, as I want to have consistent sanding through the entire piece. And I also had quite a few burns on the side of this face frame that needed to be sanded out. Once that sanding was done, it was now time to attach that face frame to the cabinets. And in this case, I'm going to use Titebond 3 as it has a little bit of a longer open time. And you'll notice here I'm applying glue to the front edge of the entire cabinet. Now pocket holes would have been a great way to attach this face frame, but frankly I didn't want to see those holes on the inside of the cabinet. Instead, I decided to go with glue and brad nails, as I've done this in the past with no problems at all. And with those clamps in place, I'm really trying to make sure that the alignment of the face frame is flush up against the bottom of the countertop. I'm also paying close attention to the side, making sure it's flush as well. With everything lined up, I could then tack it into place with some brad nails. Once one side's done, I could repeat the exact same process on the other side. Now some of you may be a little bit leery about me using brad nails on the front of this face frame, but I do have a solution for this that I'll show you at the end of the video. With that face frame on, everything is coming together very nicely, but there's a couple of details that I want to fix before we wrap up this video. If we look at the back of the countertop, you'll notice that there's a small gap in between the wall and the countertop. To hide this gap, I'm just going to add some quarter round to cover up this seam. So I'll line up my quarter round to one side of the countertop, and then I'll go over to the other side and strike a line where I need to make my cut. And I just gave it a 30-degree cut on either side of the quarter round just to give it a little bit more visual appeal. And once I had all that quarter round cut to size, I could tack it into place. And for my desktop, I did miters around the entire edge just to make it look a little bit more clean. After all, this is probably where I'm going to be spending most of my time. So now's probably the time where I should address all the nail holes that we're making in this cabinet. And this is where my old pal Timbermate comes into play. Now if you haven't used this wood filler before, this stuff is great. One of the things that I like the most about this filler is that it's water-based, so if it ever dries out, you just need to add a little bit of water to the top of it and it rehydrates. It comes in all different colors and does a great job of hiding any imperfections that you're trying to cover up. And once this stuff hardens, it's as hard as wood, making all those visual imperfections disappear. Not to mention, this stuff takes stain and it finishes very nicely. Well, that's going to about do us for today. I really think these cabinets are coming along nicely. With the butcher block top and the seamless integration of that oak face frame, these things are going to last a lifetime. Now obviously we have some gaps to fill with the holes in each one of these cabinets, but that's going to be my next video. Shop drawers. We're all going to make them eventually, and these can be really intimidating for the beginning woodworker. But today we're going to demystify them by making a variety of different types. So let's get into it. So even woodworkers that have been around for a bit all tend to dread the last piece of a cabinet build, and that's creating all the drawers that you'll need for those cabinets. And I'm no exclusion. I've just recently built some cabinets for my shop, and I've been putting off making drawers for these cabinets for well over 3 weeks. And here's a quick look at one of the sides of these cabinets. As you can see, I've got a lot of voids here, and I'd like to fill up some of these voids with some drawers. And I've got 10 of these to build, so I've got a lot of work ahead of me. So I thought this would be the perfect time to go over some of the methods for building cabinet drawers. So what's the first thing that we need to think about when building drawers? Well, the first thing that I like to do is to measure the void that we're trying to fill. As you can see here, I've already got my face frame installed, so the measurements for the width and the height need to be referenced off of that face frame. So I'll quickly measure that width, which comes in at just a little under 21 inches. After that, we can measure the height, which comes in at 27 inches. And obviously, the last dimension that we're going to need is the depth. And since I want these drawers to be flush with the face frame, I'm going to measure from the back of the cabinet all the way up to the front of the face frame. And here I get a measurement of 23 5/16. Now that I have my workable void figured out, I always like to jot it down on a piece of paper. And here's a look at that sketch with all my workable space for those drawers drawn out and all the dimensions clearly labeled. Now that we have all those dimensions, we now need to start thinking about what we're going to build those drawers with. The first thing that I like to figure out is what type of drawer slides am I going to use with these drawers. And there really are two types that I typically use. One of the more common types are these side mount drawer slides. And those work great, and they can be found in any big box store. However, they can be a little bit tricky to install if you don't get your measurements for width exactly right. So instead, I like to go for a little bit more forgiving drawer slide. And that is the bottom mount drawer slide. These give you just a little bit more flexibility since the bottom of the drawer will sit right on top of the slides. Instead of having to have your width dead on, since there's a little bit of space on either side of the rails, it gives you just a little bit more flexibility. Now, places like Rockler and Woodcraft have some high-end drawer slides like this, but frankly, they are outrageously priced. But I've had some really good luck on buying these slides off of Amazon, and I typically buy them in bulk, in packs of 10 or more. Not only do they tend to work just as well as some of those high-end brands like Bloom, but they're pennies on the dollar, and I just can't pass that up when I have multiple of these to install. And I'm not affiliated with any of this hardware, but I will leave some links to some brands that I've tried out in the past, and they seem to work just as well. And for the drawers we're making today, I'm going to be using undermount slides. So now that we know what type of slides we're using, we need to figure out what type of wood we're using for the drawers. And when I make drawer boxes, I typically only use two types of plywood, 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch for the bottom. And we'll be building all our drawers today with this material, so let's not waste any more time and build our first drawer. So let's go back to our drawing and figure out what dimension these boxes need to be to accommodate our drawer slides as well as the thickness of plywood we're using. So let's first start off with the height of these drawers. Since I have 27 inches to work with and I know I want 3 drawers in each one of these voids, the maximum height that I can have for any drawer would be about 9 inches. Now 9 inches obviously isn't going to work, as that doesn't account for any spacing in between each drawer, nor does it account for any hardware we use. On the other hand, however, our drawer fronts will probably be a lot closer to that 9-inch height. But for me, when I'm making my boxes, I like to subtract out a couple of inches. So I'm going to go with a 7-inch height for these drawers. Now that we've figured out the height, let's talk about the width. And this is a pretty easy calculation for me. Since we have 21 inches across, if I subtract the 1/2 inch, this will give me a 1/4 inch wiggle room on either side of the cabinet. The last dimension is the easiest to figure out, and that's the depth of the drawer, and that's completely determined by the drawer slides that you purchase. In the case of my drawer slides, it's 533 millimeters, which is exactly 21 inches. So let's build some drawer boxes, and we're going to build drawers in 4 different ways, starting from the easiest way to the most difficult way, and then we'll build all the rest using the preferred method. Before we build our first drawer box, we first need to understand how the plywood should be positioned within the box. And here's a bird's eye view of the first box we're going to create. As you can see, it has that depth of 21 inches as well as the width of 20.5. Now the real thing to pay attention to here is how the wood is positioned in the front and the back of the drawer. As you can see, the front and the back of the drawer are butted up against the sides of the drawer. Now the real reason that we want to have the wood in this position is so that the plies on that plywood are only showing in the front and the back of the drawer. Let me show you an example. So this is the positioning that you want to have with that plywood on your drawer. As you can see on the very front of the drawer, you can see those plies of plywood. And you can also see those plies on the very back of the drawer. But if we look at the side of the drawer, you can see it's completely clean with no visible plies. And that's exactly the layout that we're going for. And that's because no one is ever going to see the back of this drawer. They're also never going to see the front of this drawer, and that's because as soon as we're done building this box, we're going to put a drawer face on it that will cover up all those plies. And if we position the plywood in the other way, you can see there's a big difference. Even when we put that drawer front on, all those plies will be exposed on the side. So it's extremely important to pay attention to this as you're laying out your boxes, as this will affect the dimensions of each side of the drawer. Speaking of which, let's start to cut out our pieces for our first drawer box. So if we go back to our drawing, you'll see that we need 2 sides that are 21 inches long by 7 inches high. We'll also need a front and back that's 19.5 inches long by 7 inches high. Now the reason it's 19.5 inches is because the plywood we're going to be using is a 1/2 inch thick, so we have to subtract out 1 full inch. So one of the first things that we'll do is to cut out a bunch of 7-inch strips on this plywood. This 7-inch strip will ensure that all our drawer boxes have the exact same height at exactly 7 inches. And I tried to use up every bit of scrap 1/2 inch plywood that I had in my shop. The nice thing about cutting out all these strips is to make sure that all of our drawer boxes come together nicely at each corner. If you wait to cut down these strips at different times, you're just opening yourself up to having 2 sides that don't fit perfectly together. So now that I have all these 7-inch strips cut out, I should have enough to make all my drawers today. So let's grab one of these strips and cut it down to length. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll cut the front and the back of our first box down to 19.5 inches. Once that's done, I can adjust the stop block to 21 inches to cut down both of the sides. And just like that, we have all the pieces needed to make a box. So now that we have all 4 pieces for our first drawer box cut to size, we need to cut a dado on the very bottom of each one of these pieces so that we can place a 1/4 inch piece of plywood on the very bottom of that drawer. Now you could do this a lot of different ways. Initially I thought I'd put a 1/4 inch dado into my table saw and just run the pieces right through the saw. And that would be very fast and efficient. However, the 1/4 inch plywood that I got from Home Depot is nowhere near a 1/4 of an inch. And I even did a couple of test cuts to see how well this would fit, but this is just way too loose for my liking. So I'm going to have to use a table saw for this process and creep up on that perfect fit. So don't rely on your dado stack that's set exactly to a 1/4 of an inch and assume that your 1/4 inch plywood will fit perfectly into that groove. Typically, it's going to be very loose. The last thing that I want to consider is how far do I want those dados from the bottom of those 7-inch strips, and since I'm using undermount drawer slides, I typically like to go at least 1/2 of an inch. Now you could cut this dado at a 1/4 of an inch if you'd like to have that extra 1/4 inch in your drawer. However, what I've found is when you cut it that close to the edge of the plywood, you're going to get a lot of chip out, and you may not get enough support for your drawer. So in order to create these dados, I first want to grab my 1/2 inch setup block so that I can set the fence on my table saw. Once that fence is set, I'll now grab my 1/4 inch setup block so that I can set the height of my blade. With my table saw now fully calibrated, I can now make my first pass for that dado on each one of the sides of my drawer box. And lastly, I'll run a test piece through so that we can make sure we have the perfect fit for the bottom of the drawer. Then I can tap my fence over just a tad and run my test piece through once again. After that, I'll just grab a piece of the 1/4 inch plywood that I'm using for the bottoms and test the fit. And since I'm satisfied with the fit on our scrap piece, I'll now do our second pass on all the other pieces. After that, I'll put all the pieces together and do a dry fit just to see how it looks. Now it's time to go back to our drawing to figure out the dimensions for the 1/4 inch plywood that will be used for the bottom of these drawers. And since we did a 1/4 inch dado on each side, we need to subtract 1/2 of an inch from the outside dimensions of the drawer, which gives me the dimensions of 20 by 20.5. So I'll set my fence to 20.5 and rip this entire sheet of plywood to that dimension. After that, I can adjust the fence to 20 inches exactly and do cross cuts on that same sheet of plywood. And to make this 1/4 inch plywood fit a little bit better into that dado, I just like to sand each side. And once I'm finished with that sanding, I'll just do a dry fit to make sure everything's fitting together nicely. And once I'm satisfied with the fit, I can then take it all apart once again so that we can glue this thing up. And for this first box, we're going to do this the easy way, using 18 gauge 3/4 inch brad nails and some glue. So one of the first things that I'll do, since I'm not worried about wood movement since we're using plywood, is I'll put a few dabs of glue into that dado. Once I've done that, I'll add a little bit of glue on one of the sides of the front of the drawer. Then I can align the front and one of the sides of the drawer, making sure that I'm sliding that 1/4 inch plywood into the dado. Then I'll repeat the process with the back of the drawer, adding glue to one side. Then I can add just a little bit more glue on the other side into that dado. And finally, I'll add some glue on the other side of the front and the back and attach the last side. Once everything's fitting together nicely, I'll then add my 3/4 inch brad nails on both sides of the drawer. Well, that's about as easy as it gets, and for shop furniture, maybe all you need. And if you were using side mount drawer slides, you could probably call this box done. But as I said earlier, we're using undermount drawer slides, so we do need to make one alteration. And this has to do with the very back of the drawer. Since this box will be sitting on rails, we need to cut a notch out in the very back. Now we're going to be using an easier method for the rest of our boxes, but I did want to show you this quick method. And all we're really going to need for this process is a router with a flush trim bit, as well as a small flush trim saw. And what I'm really looking to do here is to remove the back lip of the drawer about 2 inches from the very side of the drawer. And we want this to be completely flush with the bottom of the drawer. And this doesn't have to be particularly pretty, as nobody's going to see the very back of this drawer. So let's get to it. So this is a little bit of a messy process, but it is easy. All I'm doing is flush cutting the back of the drawer so that it's completely even with the bottom of the drawer. And when I do this, I typically get a little bit of chip out, but that's okay. Nobody's going to see the back of this drawer. And we'll do this process on both sides of the drawer back. And once we're done with the router, we can take our flush trim saw and clean up all the corners that are rounded over. And with these little notches cut out, you can see how these drawer slides will sit completely flush on the bottom of the drawer. Well, let's move on to our second drawer box. And our second drawer box, in my opinion, is the second easiest way to make these boxes. Now for our second box, we're going to use the exact same dimensions for both the sides and the front and the back. So I'm not going to bore you with the entire process of cutting out these pieces again, and instead we're going to go right to assembly. So I've already got my 4 pieces for the drawer box cut out, including the dado. And you guessed it, we're going to be using pocket holes for this method. Now in order to use this method, it's going to be very important that you keep track of what's going to be the front and the back of the drawer box, as the front and the back will be the only 2 pieces that will get pocket holes. And in my case, I'm doing 3 pocket holes on each side, making sure that I'm paying attention to where that dado is. And what I'm trying to do is to get a pocket hole on the top and the bottom of the drawer, as well as one in the approximate center. With all of my pocket holes cut out, I now want to make an adjustment to what will be the back side of the drawer. And what I'm looking to do is to remove the material from the dado to the bottom of the drawer. So I'll take this back piece over to the table saw and slice off what's just a little bit over 1/2 inch. And with that material cut off, you can now see the difference between the front and the back of the drawer. With all the adjustments made, it's now time for glue and screws. And I used a couple of clamps just to hold everything together until I got those screws fully seated. And I really like using this combination of these 90-degree clamps with the quick clamps. The 90-degree clamps hold it into place until you can get some pressure on it with the quick clamps. Once the front and 2 sides are attached, I can then slide in the bottom. And with that bottom in place, all I have to do is to add the back of the drawer. And even though everything holds together fairly nicely at this point, I still like to add a clamp just to make sure that nothing moves. The final piece to this drawer assembly is just to hold that bottom in place just by adding a few 3/4 inch brad nails. Well, that wasn't too bad. It's a little bit more effort on the front end, but it gives you a drawer that's just a little bit more secure. Now the next drawer we're going to make is probably going to be even a little bit more secure than that pocket hole drawer, but it's going to come at a price. And this is an assembly method that I would probably only use in a shop project. So let's check out this next method. So this is by far probably one of the quickest methods out of all the ones that we're taking a look at today. I'll first do a dry assembly with the front, 2 sides, and the bottom of the drawer. After that, I'll add a little bit of wood glue to the back of the drawer and clamp it into place. Once everything is secure, I can then pre-drill and countersink into the side a couple holes into the back of the drawer. And I'll do this process on both sides of the drawer. And just for good measure, I'll remove the clamp, pre-drill, countersink, and drive in a screw where that clamp was at. With the back now screwed together, I can flip the drawer over and repeat the process on the front of the drawer. Now a lot of you have been asking what type of countersink bit do I use? And it's really a toss-up between 2 brands. Here I'm using the Amana countersink bit, but probably my favorite bit to use is the Eason countersink bit, and I'll leave a link in the description below for both bits. Once I have all those screws in place, it's just a matter of brad nailing the bottom of the drawer into the back of the drawer. Well, that was almost as easy as making a drawer with the glue and brad nails, and you're going to get a lot of strength with this drawer. However, you just can't overlook the scars that will be on the side of the drawer. Now in theory, you could cover these up with wood filler, but you're still going to be able to see them in my opinion. So you're really sacrificing looks for strength with that method. But what if there was an even stronger method that had no visible scars on the side of the drawers? That's what we're going to do next. And this method is commonly called the quarter method. But in our case, since we're using undermount drawer slides, we're going to have to modify it a bit and do the quarter half method. So how does this method work? To understand it, we need to take a closer look at this example I created. This is essentially a tongue and groove joint, as the front fits right into the side of the drawer. So why is this called the quarter method? Well, it's really quite simple. Let's take a look at this diagram. If we take a look at this diagram, you can see that all the measurements that are associated with this joint are just 1/4 inch. Now, since this is a different type of joint for these drawers, it will affect the dimensions of the front and back piece of the drawer. And that's because we're going to have a 1/4 inch tongue on the front and the back pieces, which will make the dimensions 20 inches by 7 inches. And the sides will stay the same at 21 inches by 7 inches. And in order to make these types of drawers, I had to dig up old Yeller, as she's my dedicated dado saw. And what you'll see installed in this dado saw are just the inside and outside of my dado stack that equate to exactly 1/4 inch. But we also need to set 2 other measurements to exactly 1/4 inch. And to do this, I would not rely on the measurements of your table saw, but instead grab a setup block. With that 1/4 inch dado stack in place, we now need to set the height of it to exactly 1/4 inch. Once we've confirmed that, we'll now set the fence to 1/4 inch from that dado blade. And that's all the setup that we need to do with the table saw. The first thing that we want to do is to create the grooves on both sides of the drawer box. Now, when you're putting these grooves in, I really recommend using a push block. And that's because since you're removing more material than you would with a normal table saw blade, you're going to get a little bit more resistance. And here you can see those grooves on either side of the drawer box. Now it's time to make the tongues on the front and the back of those drawer boxes, and nothing's going to change over here at the table saw. The only thing that we're going to do differently is we're going to run the front and the back of our drawer boxes vertically right up against our table saw fence. Now, it probably would have been a bright idea for me to use a featherboard in this situation. In fact, even a double stacked featherboard would probably be your best option. And with all those cuts made, you can see how the tongue on the front and the back will fit right into the sides on the drawer. Now, if my 1/4 inch plywood was exactly 1/4 inch, I could take this whole process one step further by creating the dado for that bottom piece by sliding my piece right across that dado stack. This would create that dado for the bottom panel 1/4 inch away from the bottom of each side. But as I said earlier, I need that dado to be 1/2 inch from the bottom since we're using undermount drawer slides. And I could just move my fence over so that it's 1/2 inch from the blade, but since my plywood isn't exactly 1/4 inch, I don't want to use my dado stack to make that dado. So instead, I just used my table saw. But let's put this thing together and see how it compares to the other 3 we've already created. So I went ahead and created the dado for the bottom panel of this drawer over at the table saw, and it's 1/2 inch from the bottom. Now, this type of drawer box is probably one of the easiest to assemble. With all of the tongue and the grooves, all you need to do is to add a little bit of wood glue and everything will square up perfectly. The only real disadvantage to this method is you're going to have to use clamps until that glue sets. Well, that takes us through all 4 different types of drawer builds. Now, although our last drawer box is extremely sturdy, there is one thing that concerns me, and that's that you do have to clamp it up until that glue cures. And that's a real issue for me, since I don't like to prolong the drawer building process any longer than it needs to be. So let's quickly go over the pros and cons of each drawer box. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, but I think the most enjoyable one to build was the very first one we made, with the simple glue and brad nails. The brad nails are barely visible, and this process went quick and easy. But we may be sacrificing a little bit of strength here. However, maybe not, as wood glue, which is holding this thing together, is extremely strong. Next up, we had the pocket hole screws, and in my opinion, this was extremely easy to build, and it's very durable. The only disadvantage to this method, in my opinion, is the extra time you need to spend on the front end to get all those pocket holes drilled out. The third method, and probably one of the stronger drawers we made today, was the glue and screws. Not only is it extremely strong, but it's also very quick to build. The only downfall to this method, in my opinion, is the exposed screws on the sides of this drawer. And lastly, we have one of the strongest methods of the day, the quarter method. Once you get all your calibrations dialed in at your table saw, you can really blaze through a lot of drawers at once. It's kind of like a set it and forget it. But the fact that you need to have this thing in clamps until that glue cures is kind of a deal breaker for me, as I'm not even sure that I have enough clamps to do 10 drawers at once. So what's my preferred method? Well, I think I'm going to have to go with the pocket hole screws. With just a little bit of investment on the front end, you can knock out these drawers fairly quickly and you don't need to clamp them up. Plus, they're probably one of the sturdiest drawers we built today. So I'm going to get to it and knock out my last 6 drawers using the good old-fashioned pocket hole method. So I spent the rest of the afternoon getting all these drawers set up so that I could assemble them all together. Once I got all the dados in for the bottom panels, it was just a matter of adding the pocket holes into each one of those fronts and backs of the drawers. And once I got all those pocket holes in, assembly was rather quick. Just a little bit of wood glue and a couple of screws and everything came together perfectly. And just like that, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 drawers. Well, that was a lot of work, and I still need to install these things and build drawer faces for each one of them. But I'll do that in a future video. Before we close this video out, why don't you let me know in the comments below what your favorite method is for building cabinet drawers. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since I've worked on these cabinets, and today we're going to install my final 3 drawers, make some drawer faces, as well as some cabinet doors. So let's get to it. So if you've been watching this cabinet series, you'll know that on every step of this build, I've been trying to do things a variety of different ways to see which way I like best. And in my last video, I built 10 drawer boxes 4 different ways, and I came to find out that my favorite way to build drawer boxes was with pocket hole screws and glue. And I already installed 9 of these drawer boxes, but I actually made 2 more for a total of 12 drawer boxes, and I've left 3 to install today. And the reason that I made 2 more was simply due to symmetry. I added 6 drawers to this side and 3 drawers to this side. And originally I was just going to put 1 drawer on this side, but I really don't like the way that looks. So I'm going to install 3 drawers on this side as well. And you'll also remember from the previous video that I'm using soft close undermount drawer slides. And this dictated the way I made my drawer boxes. As these type of drawer slides require a 1/2 inch gap at the bottom of the drawer, and they also require the lip on the back to be removed where the rails are going to be. And I showed you 2 different ways to do this, both by cutting down the back panel as well as routing it out. And we also talked in the previous video about how expensive this hardware is, and there's a lot of cheaper alternatives available on Amazon, and I'll leave some links to the hardware I chose in the description below. But let's get to it and install these final 3 drawers into this void so that we can get them looking good. So usually when I install drawers, I install them from the top drawer to the bottom drawer, but in this case we're going to start at the bottom. And in order to get our drawer slides to clear the face frame, I'm going to add a couple pieces of plywood on one side and 1 small piece on the other. And you can see I'm just using a couple small pieces of scrap plywood to raise the drawer slide so it clears the bottom of the face frame. And there's really only 2 steps here. I'm first adding the piece of plywood as a spacer, and then I'm attaching the drawer slide to that plywood. Once I have both drawer slides in place, I'll then take the drawer and place it right on top of those drawer slides. Then, with a little bit of force, I'll push that drawer into the back of the drawer slide so that I can get some markings from where those pins are. And here you can see that small indentation from where that pin hit the back of the drawer. And I'll use that indentation to carefully drill out 2 small holes into the back of the drawer. With those 2 holes in place, I can now begin to work on attaching the front clips to the front of the drawer. And I'm using this new Black Zero drill, which I featured a couple of weeks ago, and it's perfect for this application. And with both front clips in place, I can now place the drawer and see that soft close action. With the bottom drawer in place, I can now begin to work on the second drawer. And for this process, you'll notice that I'm using 2 longer pieces of scrap plywood to hold that spacer into place until I screw it in. And I'll use those same 2 pieces of scrap plywood to hold the drawer slide in place until it's attached to the side of the cabinet. The key to using these scrap pieces of plywood is to have them rest on the side of the bottom drawer and the front and the back of the bottom drawer at an angle. This will create a nice flat plane to give support to your drawer slides until you secure them to the side of the cabinet. And with both drawer slides in place for the second drawer, we can once again place that drawer on top of those drawer slides and give it a firm press. This will once again give us those indentations so that we know where to drill out those holes for those pins. And once again, once those holes are in, I'll drive in 3 screws to each front clip. Then we can once again place our drawer into place. And with our bottom 2 drawers in place, we can repeat all these steps for our final drawer. And I'll have to say, after installing all these drawers, I was really quite impressed with the drawer slides, especially for pennies on the dollar. With all 12 drawers now installed and working smoothly, it's now time to make these things look good. And this, in my opinion, is the fun part of building drawers, as we can customize these in any fashion that we want. And I'd really like to have a little bit of variety on these drawers. I'm thinking I'll make the top one in solid wood and the others in a shaker style. Now you may disagree with the type of wood I'm going to use for these drawers, but you can change out the wood to any species that you'd like. Now one of my favorite species of wood is mahogany.
Rich mahogany.
And because of this, I have a lot of mahogany stock in my shop. In fact, I have well over 1,500 board feet of this species cut to size at about 6 feet long. But this mahogany is rough, and that's exactly how I like to buy my wood, as you can get it for significantly cheaper than any wood that you buy surfaced. So we need to first mill this wood to clean it up, so let's go head over to the miter saw. So I used about 6 of these 6-foot boards for this project. And my first order of business is to mill this mahogany up, and I want to cut down a bunch of pieces at 23 inches. Now you'll notice as I cut this down over at the miter saw, I'm making multiple passes on each cut. And this is something that I always do when I'm milling up my lumber. A lot of times when you cut this wood down, it's going to release a lot of tension that's built up inside that wood. By repeating the cut on each slice, you're essentially removing any wood that may have moved when the tension is released. By doing it this way, you're drastically reducing the risk of having any kickback over at the miter saw. And if you've ever had kickback at the miter saw, you know that it can be quite shocking. Since I've got a lot of drawers here, I've got a lot of these 23-inch pieces to cut out. Some of these pieces will be for the top drawer, which will be solid mahogany, and some of these will be for the rails, which will be in the shaker style. I also need to cut out a few longer pieces at 31 inches, and these will be for the cabinet doors. So I'll quickly adjust my stop block and cut these down in the same fashion. Once I have all these pieces cut down to their rough size, it's time to start milling these up. And it really does make a big difference having all these pieces cut down to a smaller length when cleaning them up over at the jointer. Not only are they much easier to handle, but it's a heck of a lot safer. And there's not as much waste either, because if there was a significant cup or bow in the wood, a lot of this is diminished when you cut the pieces down to smaller size. Now I've had straight blades on this jointer ever since I purchased it about 6 years ago. But I just recently got an aftermarket helical head for this jointer, and I was thinking about making a video on the installation process, so let me know down in the comments section if this is something you might be interested in seeing. I'm always a little bit hesitant to do videos like this as the subject might be a little bit dry, but if it's something you guys might be interested in, I'd be happy to do it. Well, as you can see here, I spent a lot of time at the jointer cleaning up all these boards. But getting through the jointer was only half of it, as I had to go over to the planer. And the planer was thankfully a little bit quicker, as I only needed to surface one side. But even so, since I had so many boards, it seemed like I was feeding this thing for days. But once I had it all cleaned up, it was now time to lay out my solid wood drawer fronts. And I spent just a little bit of time flipping these boards around trying to find out the best combination for these solid wood drawer fronts. And once I had each piece of wood with its matching pair, I then cleaned up the final side over at the table saw. And then it was finally time for glue up, which allowed me to use one of my favorite tools in the shop, the clamp companion. Now if you're not familiar with how this system works, check out this video here as I go into detail on the functionality of this system. This is made by a small American business out of Wisconsin, and the owner, Reed, is just a really nice guy. I'll leave a link in the description below so that you can go check out this system made by RS Tool and see if it's something that you may want to add to your shop. It's been a game changer for me, as I'm able to clamp up panels with my pipe clamps while not tying up my assembly table. And with it raised like this, you can even add clamps to the top to make sure your panels are completely flat. Not to mention, it's super easy to clean up that glue squeeze out both on the top and the bottom of the panel. With those panels curing up, it was getting late, so I decided to stack and sticker the rest of my lumber. The next day, I returned to the shop and I was excited to get back into it. The first order of business was to take off all those clamps on those panels. With all my clamps off, I now had my stock for my 4 solid wood drawer fronts. But even with my glue cleanup yesterday, I still had a lot of glue that I needed to clean up. And I also wanted to dimension everything to its final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. So I went back to my planer and I churned and burned until all those pieces were the exact same thickness. With all of our wood now milled down to 3/4 of an inch, I now want to start the installation process of our first drawer fronts. And these are going to be the solid mahogany drawer fronts on the very top. Now typically when I install drawers, I work from the bottom up, but in this case, since we have a different drawer front for the very top, I'm going to start at the top. So I'm going to go get some measurements and get these top drawers cut down to size. So the first order of business was to double check the dimensions of each one of the top drawers. Once I had those dimensions, I cut down each one of our top drawers down to size. And for each one of these drawer faces, I cleaned up one side and then used a stop block to cut it down to the exact length. And I took each one of these cuts extremely slow as I wanted to creep up on the exact measurement. And after going back and forth a few times, I was able to get the length cut down to size with a little bit of reveal on either side of the drawer. Then it was time to take a measurement for the height of these drawers. And it turns out I needed to remove 1.5 inches from each one of these drawer fronts. But I didn't want to take all this material off of one side, as it would make the seam off-center from the drawer. So I needed to remove 3/4 inch on either side to keep that seam right in the middle. So for all these drawer fronts, I cut 3/4 off one side, adjusted the fence, and cut 3/4 off the other side. And it's this little attention to detail that's going to make a big difference in the overall appearance of each one of these drawer fronts. And once all these drawer fronts are cut to height, you can see how that seam is directly in the middle. With our top drawer fronts cut to size, I now want to attach them to our drawer boxes. And to do this, I'm going to try a new method that I think might work pretty well. Now this is a method that incorporates the drawer pulls to attach the drawer face to the drawer box. Now since all of our drawer faces are the exact same width, I'm going to use this simple jig to attach the hardware right in the center of the drawer face. And once I pre-drill those holes into the drawer face for the pulls, I'll then drive in a couple of screws into those same holes into the drawer box. And this will probably be a lot easier for me to show you than to explain it, so let's get started. So I absolutely love this little jig. I'm dealing with 3-inch drawer pulls, and it allows me to perfectly center each one of these pulls on the center of the drawer face. And once I have all my alignments made, I can drill the holes for the screws right through the center of the board. With those holes drilled, I'll then take my drawer face and center it onto that drawer box using some shims. Then I can just drive in some wood screws into those pre-drill holes to attach the drawer face to the drawer box. Then I can open the box and permanently secure it using some screws in the back of the drawer. And with the 2 screws on the interior of the drawer, I can now remove the 2 screws that we drove into those drawer pull holes. Then I can take my drawer and drill all the way through those 2 holes into the drawer box. And after that, it's just a matter of attaching the drawer pull hardware. And this truly is an easy way to make sure all of your alignments are perfect. And with the first one complete, I'll repeat this process for the other 3 drawers. Now this was the first time that I actually used these handy shims that I featured a couple of weeks ago, and these work great for this purpose. With their different gauges, I could find the perfect reveal for each drawer. And just like that, I had all 4 of our top drawers finished. Well, I'm super pleased with how these looked, and I'm even more impressed with how easy it was to put these drawer fronts on using the drawer pull method. But we've got a lot more drawer fronts to do. In fact, we've got 8 of them, and I'd like to do shaker style on each one of these drawers. So I'd like to have these 2 bottom drawer faces the exact same size, so I'm just taking a measurement of the void underneath the top drawer. And this comes in at 18 3/4, so we'll divide that by 2, which gives us 9 3/8. So I'll go over to the miter saw and set up a stop block at this exact measurement. These pieces that I'm cutting are going to be for the stiles on the drawers. For each one of these pieces, I'll be able to rip them in half and create 2 stiles from each board. And with all my cuts made, I've got my 8 pieces for my 8 drawers. Now I want to cut these stiles to the appropriate width, and I'm going to go with 2 inches exactly. So I'll cut each one of these 8 pieces into 2 2-inch strips. And just like that, we have 16 stiles. But in order to complete these drawer fronts, we're also going to need some rails so that they can look like this. And since we have 2 2-inch stiles, we need to cut the rails down to 4 inches shorter than the drawers that we just made. So I'll quickly cut a few boards down to the appropriate width. Now since these cavities on either side of the cabinet will also have shaker style drawers, I want to get the dimensions of this cabinet as well. And these will have a 3/4 inch overhang on all sides of the door. So I'll quickly get the dimensions of the void and add 1.5 inches to get the total dimensions for the cabinet door. Then I'll head over to the miter saw and cut these pieces down to length. With all of my pieces cut to size, I can now rip each piece down to the 2-inch width. And there were a lot of these, and my dust collection seemed to get clogged as I was cutting these pieces down. And once I had all these rails and stiles cut to size, I then organized them and placed them on top of each cabinet. So now that we have all the rails and stiles cut out for these shaker style drawer fronts, we need to cut out the tongue and grooves for each drawer front frame. And the easiest way that I've found to do this is over at the table saw. So let's calibrate this table saw so that we can cut out all those tongue and grooves. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll grab my 1/2 inch setup block and set the height of my table saw to 1/2 of an inch. Now since we're dealing with 3/4 inch stock, I'll set my table saw fence to 1/4 of an inch. This in theory allows me to cut one side, flip the board around and cut the other side and give me a 1/2 inch groove right in the center of that 3/4 inch stock. And with all those calibrations made, it's just a matter of rinse and repeat for all those rails and stiles. Well, that was quite the tedious process, but we're not out of the weeds yet, as we need to cut the tongues on each side of every single one of those rails. And we're once again going to do this over at the table saw. We're going to cut off a 1/2 inch on either side, just leaving the center tongue at 1/4 of an inch. And this is a process that I like to creep up on, so I've cut a scrap piece so that we can get our calibrations. So here I'm just setting the height of the table saw so that it will remove that 1/4 inch strip. Once I have the height of the table saw set, I'll remove both sides of the scrap piece to expose the tenon. And with the tenon exposed, I can now test the fit on one of our rails. And happy with the fit, I can now set my stop block on my miter gauge to cut out all of those tongues. And if there's one thing I've learned from this project, in doing a larger project, there's a lot of tedious processes. Whether it's milling, cutting the grooves, or even the tongues, this process becomes so repetitive it's easy to make a mistake. So for me, it's important that I keep my mind on each one of these cuts so that I don't make a stupid mistake this far along in the process. Once I have the tongues cut out on 2 of the rails, I'll just do a test fit to make sure this is turning out how I want it. And happy with the results, I'll continue the mind-numbing process of cutting out the rest of the tongues on all of the rails. With all of the tongues cut out, it's now time to focus on the panels that will sit inside the front of each one of these drawer faces. As you can see, each panel has a 1/2 inch lip that slides into that groove on one side. So I'll assemble the rails and stiles of a drawer face and then add an inch to the width and height so that we can make those panels. And that extra inch added to the height and width of each panel is to account for the 1/2 inch tongue that will slide into the 1/2 inch groove on each one of the rails and stiles. So I'll first cut all my panels down to the appropriate length using a stop block over at the miter saw. Once those panels are cut down to length, I'll take them over to the table saw and cut them to width at 6 1/4 inches. With the panels cut to size, I'll head over to the router table and raise my rabbiting bit to 1/4 of an inch. And this rabbiting bit removes a 1/2 inch of material, which is perfect to create the tongues on these panels. So I'll take each one of my drawer faces and remove a 1/2 inch of material from each side to create the tongue for each one of these panels. Now this is a fairly safe cut, but I am using a paddle just to make sure that nothing slips on me. With the tongues created on all 4 sides of the panel, I can do a test fit with the rails and stiles just to make sure that everything fits together perfectly. But I also need to do this process for the cabinet doors. So I'll quickly get the dimensions of my cabinet door and cut each piece of plywood down to size. Then in the same fashion, I can create that 1/2 inch rabbet on one side of the panel. And once that 1/2 inch rabbet is created on all 4 sides of the panel, I can do a test fit to make sure that it fits perfectly on the rails and stiles for the door. After that, it was time for glue up, so I glued up all these panels with the rails and stiles and made sure that everything fit together perfectly. After letting everything cure up overnight, I came back the next day and took everything out of clamps. Then I hit everything with a sander to clean everything up. And there were a couple of gaps here and there, but these were easily cleaned up with a little bit of wood glue and sanding it up without the dust collection on. And this process made all those gaps virtually disappear. Once all that sanding was done, I could now begin the process of adding these drawer faces to the drawers. Just like before, I'll use my jig to drill out the holes for this hardware right on the center of the drawer faces. Then I could center the drawer face with some shims and drive in a couple of screws to attach it to the drawer box. And with a couple of permanent screws added to the inside of the drawer box, I could then take out those screws and drill the holes all the way through the drawer box. Then it was just a matter of adding the hardware. Now when I was adding the permanent screws on the inside of the box, I quickly learned that you needed to drive those screws exactly where those stiles were, as my first screw actually poked out where that panel was. But nobody needs to know about that. I also came to realize that the drawer screws that I grabbed were just a little bit too long. This made the drawer pull not sit completely flush on the drawer front, but this is easily dealt with a couple of washers. And once those washers were added to the inside of the drawer box, that drawer pull fit perfectly. And I'll have to admit, adding these washers was kind of an idiot move on my part, as I eventually found the smaller screws in the very bottom of the hardware box. So with the smaller screws found, I could eventually add all these drawer fronts to the rest of the drawers. Once all those drawer fronts were added, I now needed to add the cabinet doors. So the first thing that I did was I drilled out the holes using my Kreg jig for these European style hinges. And I added these holes both to the top and the bottom of each door, making sure that they had the same distance from the edge of the door. Then I grabbed my square and lined up the flat edge of the hinge and screwed in 2 screws into each hinge. And I'm using a center finding bit to pre-drill each of these holes. These bits really prevent the hinge from moving on you once you drive in your screws. After that, I headed over to the cabinet and used these 2 lifters to hold the door in place as I secured it to the cabinet. And with one cabinet door installed, I could then move over to the other side and repeat the process with the other door. And with both doors installed, I just needed to add the hardware to each door. So I carefully made my measurements where I needed to drill my holes for this hardware, and then I added each door handle. And I'm just as pleased with these soft close hinges as I was with those drawer slides. Well, that's going to wrap up today's video. I couldn't be more pleased with how these cabinets turned out. From the solid mahogany drawers to the beautiful shaker style drawers, and even the cabinet doors, this is going to be a bench that's going to last me a lifetime. That's right, the wife took the kids and Bert on vacation to Disney World, which can only mean one thing. We can actually get some stuff done around the shop here, so let's build some stuff. What in the hell is this place? So I'm just excited to have this staycation as my kids were to go to Disney World. And that's because rarely do I have a moment to myself, and this staycation is very short-lived. I've got 4 days to finish off a project before they get home, and my biggest worry is I won't get it done in that time. So I need to be productive, work quickly, and stay on a timeline. And this project is to build the upper cabinets for this bench in my shop. And today is day 1 of this build, and I have a pretty lofty goal today of building the cabinet carcasses and hanging them on the wall. And day 2's goals are just as lofty, as I'll have to build 6 cabinet doors and the face frame for those cabinets. But day 3 has a little bit of cushion room, as I just want to get those doors hung on the cabinets. And day 4's got more cushion, as I just want to be able to put everything away and have this shop looking nice. As I should be able to put away everything that's been sitting on this old bench in my corner. So since we're dealing with a lot of time restraints here, this is going to be a little bit different format, and we're going to be moving a lot faster. So let's get to it and see if we can knock this thing out in 4 days. It's going to be tough. So first off, I need to work on the dimensions of these cabinets. Now most cabinets are anywhere from 12 to 14 inches deep, but I'm not quite sure how tall or wide these should be. So first I'm going to power up my laser level to figure out where I want the bottom of these cabinets to rest. And after a little bit of back and forth, I've settled in at about 20 inches from the top of these cabinets. And with that determination made, I'm going to go up about 30 inches from that laser line. This will give me the right type of height that I need for my cabinets. And I want the width of the upper cabinets to match the width of my lower cabinet, so I'm just going to take a simple measurement. And these come in at right at 6 feet wide. And just like I have 3 sections for the bottom cabinets, I want 3 sections for the upper cabinet, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of math. And I'm not going to bore you with it, but I just did some back of the napkin calculations to give me all the dimensions for all the pieces that I need for this cabinet. And after that, I've fired up my old cut list optimizer to figure out how I needed to cut up this plywood. And with those determinations made, it was time to start breaking down this plywood. And I'm going to go with a 14-inch deep cabinet, so I need to cut 7 strips at 14 inches. And for this project, a tool that became indispensable was my Jessam stock guides. Since I was cutting up all this plywood by myself, these stock guides really gave me some assurance that my cuts were safe. Next, it was time to cut down some 3-inch strips for the stretchers. With all my plywood cut out, I can now mark out the length of the top and the bottom of these cabinets at 22.5. Then I can take that marking and set my stop block on my MFT so that I can make 12 repeatable cuts on this strip. And the MFT became just as important as those stock guides for breaking down this plywood. And while I was using my MFT along with my track saw, this was the first time that I realized that the MFT is very similar to a radial arm saw. The MFT is probably just a little bit safer since the blade is buried, but it does have a lot of similarities. And although less common these days, I'd love to get my hands on a radial arm saw. If any of you guys have a radial arm saw, leave a comment below and let me know. I'd love to get your impressions with it. And once I had all the panels cut down, it was now time to focus on the stretchers. And I tackled these in the exact same fashion that I tackled those panels. And with all these stretchers cut down to size, I really felt like I was making some progress. With all my tops and bottoms and stretchers cut to size, it's now time to work on the sides. And these will come in right at 30 inches, so I'll make my markings and take it over to the MFT. And just like before, I'll line up my marking to my track and set my stop block so that I can make repetitive cuts. And this stop block really made it easy to make repetitive cuts with the MFT. Not only does this MFT have the functionality of a radial arm saw, but it also has a lot of the functionality of a miter saw. The only disadvantage of the MFT is you really need to check the calibration of it every single time you use it. And although I didn't show it on camera, I spent about 5 minutes with a square just to make sure everything was locked down. And once those side panels were cut down, we had all the pieces we need to make the cabinet carcasses. Well, that was a lot of cutting, but we're not out of the woods yet. The next thing that I want to do is to cut a cleat on 6 of the stretchers. And to do this, I'm just going to take my delve square and get my blade to 45. Then I'll grab 6 of my 3-inch strips that we're going to cut cleats into. And I'm just going to move my fence over to 2 1/4 so that we can get a perfect 45. And with my table saw set up, we can rip these 6 strips. Now you may be a little bit confused here, but it will make sense in just a few moments. All these strips will be on the top of the back side of the cabinet. This will make installation of the cabinets a heck of a lot easier since I'm a one-man show. And once I had all 6 of these stretchers cut with the cleat, it was now time to move on to the next step. With our stretchers, our side panels, and our tops and bottoms now made, it's now time to think about the back panel. And the back panel is going to be made with 1/4-inch plywood, Home Depot 1/4-inch plywood, which is frankly junk. However, it's all I have access to. So we need to make a slot for this 1/4-inch plywood to fit into, and that's what we're going to do next. So I'll first grab my 1/2-inch setup block and we'll set the height of the table saw. With the height set to 1/2 inch, we can now adjust the table saw fence. And I'm just going to place a scrap piece of 3/4-inch plywood in between the blade and the fence and lock the fence down. With my table saw set, I can now make my first pass on these 24 pieces of plywood. So let's get started. And holy smokes, this sucked. I had so many of these panels, it was really hard for me to concentrate on what I was doing. And this is exactly when mistakes can happen, so I really had to focus and not listen to a podcast, but focus on the cut. And the very last piece that I'll cut is just a scrap piece of plywood. Once I have my first pass on that scrap piece, I'll then tap my fence over and make my secondary cut. Then I can do a test fit on the plywood I'm using just to make sure that it will fit in that slot. Then it was back to making my second pass on each piece of plywood that I did my first cut on. Now that we have all those slots for the back panel, it's getting kind of late. It's 6:30 right now, and I actually have a conference call at 7, so I might have to wrap up today early. Which for me isn't that convenient because it's putting that much more pressure on the remaining 3 days. But I know I can work tomorrow night into the wee hours, so hopefully I'll catch up then. Well, it's go time. We didn't get where we wanted to yesterday, so we got some catching up to do. We did make some progress yesterday, however, I've got some lofty aspirations for today. I want to get these boxes made, get them hung on the wall, make some face frames, as well as the doors for this cabinet. Before we go to assemble all these, I want to add some shelf pin holes to the sides of each one of these cabinets, so let's do that next. So to avoid any confusion when doing my shelf pin holes, I'm going to take half the panels and mark T for top on one side and take the other half of the panels and mark a T for top on the other side. If I make sure to reference these markings when doing my shelf pin holes, this will ensure that all the shelf pin holes will line up on either side of the cabinet. And for these cabinets, I'm using 1/4-inch shelf pin holes. And this Milescraft jig worked pretty well for this. I did notice, however, that sawdust got trapped in the bit a few times and caused that spring not to reload. So it probably would have been in my best interest to use some dust collection when I was drilling these holes. With all those shelf pinholes drilled out, I now want to focus on the next tedious process, which is to drill out all those pocket holes. And I'm just going to put 3 pocket holes on each side of the top and bottom panels. You know, I don't know why it took me so long to use dust collection with my pocket hole jig. For years, I never did it, but once I hooked up my dust collector to my pocket hole jig, I realized how effective it was. I would even argue that there's no other tool that has better dust collection than a pocket hole jig. Makes me wonder if some of those industrial pocket hole jigs work just as well with dust collection, like the Craig Foreman or the Castle one. Maybe you have some experience with those machines. Let me know in the comments if you do. With all my pocket holes drilled out, I now want to focus on the back panel, which will just be cut out of 1/4-inch plywood. Not only did I put pocket holes in the tops and the bottoms of the cabinets, but I also put them into the stretchers. Let me show you something really quickly. Now each one of these cabinets is going to get a flat stretcher which has pocket holes drilled out in a normal way, as well as a cleat stretcher. And you can see I've offset those pocket holes so that they don't interfere with the cleat. And for my cabinets, I need to cut these to 23 inches wide. And I should be able to get all 6 panels out of this one sheet of plywood, but I tend to make mistakes, so I may have to dig into another sheet. So with those back panel strips cut out, I now want to assemble this thing. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to attach the 2 side panels to the bottom panel. And I'll just use a little bit of wood glue and 1.25-inch pocket hole screws. In my opinion, it's really a pleasure assembling cabinets once you have all those pocket holes drilled out. All I'm doing here is using a corner clamp and a quick clamp to hold it into place until I drive in those screws. And believe it or not, since I was in such a time crunch, I even considered making these cabinets without any glue. But luckily I decided to use my better judgment and add it anyway, even if I was going to be a little bit late with this project. Once I had the bottom and the side panels attached, I can then add the stretchers. And you'll see with the top stretcher, or the one with the cleat, I'm offsetting it from the top of the cabinet by 1 inch. I did this inch offset so that all the tops of the cabinets would perfectly line up once I went to install them. With the foundation of the cabinet built, I can now measure out for my back panel. And with the size now known, I can cut that 23-inch strip down to size. Then I can just slide it into place and we can add the top to this cabinet. And I just used a 36-inch quick clamp to hold the panel in place until I drove in those pocket hole screws. And just like that, we have our first finished cabinet carcass, but I've got 5 more of these to make, so I'm going to get to it. So luckily this assembly process went pretty smoothly. Pocket holes always take a little bit more time on the front end, but it really does make assembly a breeze. But even so, assembling 6 cabinets still took a lot of time. But once it came together, I was really happy with the results, and each one of these cabinets was really sturdy. Well, that took quite some time, but I finally got all 6 boxes made. Now I need to get these things hung on the wall. And this is where those cleats that I placed on the top of each cabinet are going to come into play. This should make the installation process a heck of a lot easier, especially since I'm a one-man band this week. So here I've got this laser mounted to this post, and this should give me a reference line for where I need to hang my cleats on the wall. And as long as I line up the top of each cleat to this laser line, I should be in good shape. So for this process, I just lined up the top of the cleat to the bottom of the laser. Once I had my alignments, I drove a screw right into the center of the cleat. With the screw in the middle, this allowed me to make micro adjustments to either side before I drove in my second and third screw. And now comes the true test. Can I hang 3 of these cabinets by myself? That'll work. So now I'll just need to repeat this process for the other side. And each one of these cleats is about 12 inches long, and I tried to place these right about where the center of that cabinet would lie. And I repeated the process of driving in my center screw and then making micro adjustments before I drove in my second and third screw. And just like before, my cabinets fit perfectly into place. Now I'm not going to lie, this turned out pretty well, but we're not done yet, as the cleats aren't actually going to hold it to the wall. I'm going to drive a few screws into each one of these cabinets and connect them all together. So for this process, I attached each cabinet to each other with 2 screws on the side, making sure that the tops and the bottoms were perfectly aligned. And once the cabinets were attached to each other, I then drove in a couple of screws into the back of each cabinet to hold it to the wall. Well, it's almost 3 o'clock and we finally got what was supposed to be done yesterday complete. The The next thing on our task list is to build a face frame for this, and I'm going to build this out of white oak, which is what I use for the bottom cabinets. Not only do I want to mill up some white oak, but I also want to do some mahogany, as this is what we use on the exterior of those shaker style doors. So I'm not going to waste any more time and start milling up all of this lumber. I don't know if you're like me or not, but I actually enjoy the process of milling up my own lumber. The problem is it's really time consuming and it doesn't really make good content. And since all my wood was fairly dimensional, I tried to repeat the same process on each board. First with a couple of passes on the face and the side of the board over at the jointer. Then I could smooth out the opposite face over at the planer. And after that I cut out all my strips and cleaned up the opposite edge over at the table saw. Well, that took a long time to mill up all this wood, and I'm getting tired, so I think I'm going to call it a night. Now I'm obviously still behind schedule, but I think I got a good head start for tomorrow. So I'll see you tomorrow and we'll finish up this project. Hopefully. Ooh, it's getting cold out there. So here we are, day 3, and it's do or die time, so let's get to it. So today I'm going to be dedicated to doing just a couple of things. I first want to assemble the face frame and get it installed on the cabinets. The second thing that I want to do is to at least get the doors created so that we can get them installed. So let's get started and start up with that face frame. Now for the bottom cabinet, I used dominoes for the face frame, but since time is of the essence for this build, I think I'm going to use pocket hole screws and glue. So I'm going to get a final measurement of these cabinets so that I can cut our pieces down to size. Once I had all my measurements, I set my stop block and began to cut all these pieces down to size. And whenever I could make 2 cuts at the same time, I tried to do so. This ensured that the length and the height of the face frame was exactly the same. With all my cuts made and everything coming together nicely, it's now time to put the pocket holes in. I'll have to say after assembling this face frame, I really prefer pocket hole joinery over using dominoes. By using the pocket holes, everything came together very quickly and I didn't have to wait overnight until that glue set. Now some of these pieces, like the rails for my face frame, were really long and they barely fit underneath my ceiling. But I managed to get both sides done so that I could begin my assembly. And for assembly, I just used a little bit of wood glue for the long-term bond as well as a face clamp. And once I had it secured, I could then drive in my pocket hole screws. So I quickly went around the edges of the face frame to assemble my border. Now since I wanted this face frame to cover up the seams in between the cabinets, I hung this face frame up on the cabinets with a couple of clamps. This allowed me to mark out where those interior faces should go on the face frame. And once I had those markings, I could square them up and glue and screw them into place. While we let the glue on these face frames cure up, let's move on to making some of the cabinet doors. So essentially I want to replicate the doors that are on the bottom cabinet, and if you saw my previous videos, these aren't that difficult to make. The majority of the work's going to be done at the table saw, but we need to do a little bit of setup first. And there's not a whole lot that needs to be done here. We'll first grab our 1/2-inch setup block so that we can set our table saw height. And with our table saw blade set, we can now adjust our fence to 1/4 of an inch away from the blade. And with that done, I've got a lot of work ahead of me. I'm going to run each one of these pieces through one side and then I'll flip it around and run it through on the other side. And this will give me a 1/4 inch groove right down the center of each one of these pieces. So I'm going to get to this and start blazing through these pieces. And once again, this is one of those mind-numbing processes where you really need to pay attention so that you don't make any mistakes. Well, that was a lot of cuts, but we're not done yet. The next thing we need to do is to cut these down to size. But in order to do that, I want to get these face frames installed. And to do this, I'm just going to coat all the fronts of these cabinets with glue, and then we can attach the face frame with clamps and shoot a few pin nails in. And I'm just going to use a little bit of Titebond 3 as it's got a little bit longer open time. And I'm just going to roll this on with a silicone glue roller just to make this process a little bit faster. Not only did I use the roller, but I also used the brush, as there were some areas where I didn't feel like I was getting adequate coating. With that glue in place, I'm going to hoist it up and hold it up with clamps. And this took me a little bit of time, making a bunch of micro adjustments. I used my fingers to go around all the edges to make sure that it was properly centered. And once I feel like everything's properly aligned, I'll just tack it into place with some pin nails. Now you probably won't even be able to see these pin nails, but I will add some wood fillers right at the very end. And with that face frame in place, you can see how much cleaner it looks than before. And with one done, I'll just repeat the process on the other. Isn't it funny how the second time you do something, it takes about half the amount of time? This second one went up quick and easy. With both face frames now installed, I want to continue on with the building of the cabinet doors. And in order to continue on, I need to cut this rough stock down to size. And for these doors, I'm looking for a 1/2 inch overhang of the door on the face frame around the entire void. So I'm just going to take a couple of measurements just to confirm. And with my measurements confirmed, I'm just going to cut this stock down to size. And since all these doors will be about the same, I just used a stop block to make sure all my cuts were even. Well, that should be all that we need to do for the stiles on these cabinet doors. However, we need to make some tongues for the rails. To do this, I'm going to lower the blade until it's right below the groove on this workpiece. Then I'm going to do a test cut on the end of one of the rails to see how close we are from creating that tongue. And once I'm comfortable with the fit on my test pieces, I can continue to hog out the rest of that tongue. And this is going to take a while, as I've got 12 of these and I have to do both sides of the rails. Now this is where a miter gauge like this comes in really handy. I'm able to use that stop block on the very end of the miter gauge to make my first cut, and then I can hog out the rest. I will have to say, however, that this Craig miter gauge is not perfect. There's a little bit of slop in it, and I may be upgrading soon. With all of these pieces cut out, you can see how this comes together. The only thing left to do is to cut out a panel that will slide right in the center. And I'm going to make this panel out of 1/2 inch birch plywood, which will be very stable, but the first thing I need to do is to rip it down. Once again, the Jessam stock guide is the star of the show. And with my pieces ripped, I can now cross-cut them to size. And along with that stock guide, the MFT has been an integral part of this project. I guess I never realized how important these two tools were until I started making these cabinets. With all my panels now cut out, I now need to create a tongue around the edge of this panel. And I'll do this by using a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit over at my router table that I've raised 1/4 inch high. And all I have to do is to create that rabbet around the entire edge of the panel, making sure that the ugly side is facing down. Now having a paddle to make these cuts was really helpful. Since I was removing so much material, it just gave me a little bit more support. And after that, I can do a test fit to make sure everything comes together nicely. And pleased with the results, I can cut out the rest of the rabbets on the other panels. All I have to say is I need a better dust collection system for my router. Right now I'm using a shop vac and it doesn't seem to collect that much material. With all these panels cut out, there's only one more thing left to do, and that's to glue them up. Now the nice thing about glue ups with these shaker style doors is you only need 2 clamps. And there really isn't a whole lot of glue needed either, just a little bit on each tenon, including the cheeks, and you're good to go. Having a glue brush for this process was really helpful. It allowed me to apply the glue exactly where I wanted. And sometimes you'll need to give a little bit of a love tap just to get it into place. And with one door glued up, I'm going to put this aside and glue up the rest so that we can call this a day. Luckily, I had just enough clamps to do this. I had 12 parallel clamps, and that was perfect for these 6 doors. Well, that was a lot of work and I'm spent, but we did get what we wanted to get done today. So I'm going to go up to the house, get some rest, and hopefully we can finish this tomorrow. Whew. Well, it's day 4, and this is my last day to get these cabinets built, but I think we're in good shape. I'm not sure I'll be able to put everything away, however, I do think we'll get these cabinets built, as we only have to complete the doors and get them on these cabinets. So first things first, let's get these doors out of clamps, get them sanded up so that we can continue to work on them. Now for some reason I didn't use these glue mats when I was gluing up the doors, however I am going to use them to secure the doors when I do my sanding. And luckily these doors glued up pretty well. There was a couple of seams in between the rails and the stiles, but with a little bit of glue and some sanding these seams disappeared. So now that I've got all these doors sanded up, let's start to talk about the hardware that I'm going to put on these doors. So I bought this set of European style soft close hinges on Amazon, and I got about 50 of them for just about 60 bucks. And installation for these is really quite easy. All I'm going to use is a hinge jig from Craig as well as a clamp. All I need to do is to set the jig on the very edge of the door and clamp it into place. And with everything clamped down, I can just drill a hole on either side of the door. Once that hole's drilled out, you can see how nicely that hinge fits right on the side of the door. Once I have those holes drilled out with the Forstner bit, I then like to take a square as well as a self-centering bit to pre-drill the holes for the screws. By lining up the square on the edge of the door, I can square up the hinge and pre-drill those holes. And then it's just a matter of screwing the hinges in place. Now for this first set of hinges, I used a hand screwdriver, but for the rest of them, I actually used an impact driver. So I'm going to get to it and get the rest of these 5 doors installed with those hinges. And this was really like an assembly line. This went very quickly and I was able to get all those hinges perfectly installed. With all my hinges installed, I've got them placed where they're going to go, and there's only one more thing left to do to these doors before we actually mount them to the cabinets. And that is to install the door handles. And once again, I bought these on Amazon and they're a heck of a lot cheaper than you see at the big box store. And to install these, I'm actually going to use a jig. Let's take a quick look at it. By referencing the side and the bottom of this door, this jig allows me to pre-drill my 2 holes perfectly for this 3-inch handle. And once I have my placement down, it's just a matter of drilling out those holes repetitively. And with my 2 holes drilled out, I can quickly add that handle in just a matter of moments. And with 1 handle installed, I can make sure all 6 of these handles are perfectly aligned. So I'm going to get busy and install the rest of these handles so that we can finish this project up. I'll leave a link in the description for this jig. This is a really nice one and I think it costs less than 30 bucks. With all the doors now finally completed, all I need to do is to attach them to the cabinets. And here you'll see at the bottom, I've clamped on an 1.5 inch spacer to give me a 1/2 inch reveal. This is not only going to help me with alignment, but it's also going to support the door while I install it. And to install these doors, I'm using a self-centering bit and pre-drilling into the face frame. And once I have that pilot hole drilled out, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to drive in the screw with my impact driver. And just like before, I've got 5 more of these to do. The repetitiveness of this project was really helpful with my skill level. Having to do everything 6 times has really given me a lot of practice and has actually given me some confidence that I can build some cabinets in the future. Whew! Well, that is it, and just in the nick of time, as I got to pick up my wife and Bert in about 2 hours at the airport. Well, I'm super pleased with the results, and I couldn't be more happy I've got all this extra storage. Now, I do need to add some shelf to those cabinets, but I'll do that at another time. In the meantime, I'm going to focus on that last task of putting shit away. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, and hopefully you learned just a little bit something like I did. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Also, make sure you check out my website, www.flynndogwoodwork.com. Until next time, take care as always.